Welcome to the latest edition of our Condition Book podcast series here at West Point Thoroughbreds. I am Joe Bianca, an ownership advisor at West Point Thoroughbreds, joined as always by Aaron Birkenhauer, the Chief Operating Officer at West Point, and Tom Bellhouse, the Executive Vice President at West Point. Good morning, guys.
Good morning, Joseph.
Good
Good to
morning.
see you, as always. We're getting a lot of good feedback on this series, so thank you to all the partners who are watching and commenting. There's still more to cover, so we'll do probably a couple more of these. Today, we're going to focus on some new topics, jockeys and jockeys agents, how to pick the jockey, and then what can happen sometimes after you have the jockey secured, the logistics of shipping horses around to different racetracks. We wanted to start with one more specific example of horses who have been a little bit difficult to manage with the condition book over the recent years. And I feel like this horse is one of Tommy's babies, QF75. So we had some issues with him last year trying to find a spot simply because he's one of these horses that needs a bit of spacing between his races. So if something comes up quick, you're not necessarily going to wheel him back, even if it fits him from a condition standpoint. Tom, can you just take us through the last year or two with QF75 and some of the challenges that we faced with him?
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. And he is one of my favorites. He's the first son we've ever had of Vancouver, who is a really fascinating horse that raced in Australia. And we got him, and I believe, Aaron, we got him at the 2-year-old sales. And you look at, Timonium, thank you. And you look at his early career, and, he had a nice start to his career right at the beginning of his 3-year-old season down at Gulfstream, ran third, ran fourth, but only beaten 2 lengths in each, came up to Belmont, and actually, I believe that was Belmont Stakes week, if I'm not mistaken, and a monsoon hit that day. And we stayed in on the dirt, and he almost got it done. He went wire to wire and just got nailed in the last 16th of a mile. So it was really exciting to know that if it came to that, he could still compete on a different surface if necessary. And then if you look, we wheeled back in just over 3 weeks, and he came and he ran another bang-up race, finishing third. Now, this is where it kind of all starts to make a pattern. Right after that, he needed some time off. So he basically was off for 8 months, and he came back at Gulfstream, and he put in just a dazzling performance. For those of us who remember that race, he got out on the lead. Irad had him, and he just tapped him on the shoulder at the 8th pole, and it was never in doubt. And it was a thrilling race, and you can see he ran a 9 on the trainer data, and we really were excited to move forward. We ran on Derby Day, or Derby, I think it was Derby week, right there at Churchill. And same thing, he had the lead, and he just got caught late. That was at 9 furlongs also. We come back, we run second at Belmont, and once again, we wheel back in less than 4 weeks to try to stretch him out into a really long race, because he looked like that's what he craved, getting an easy lead in distance. And it was just too far for him. But sure enough, came back on that under 4 weeks rest. Now we need just about 10 months off. So we run 4 times to start his career. We need 8 months off. We run 1, 2, 3, 4 times again. We need 10 months off. So now we're sitting there and we're going, okay, he might be a horse that needs a little more time between races. He's real hard on himself. He tries very hard in every race, one of the reasons we love him. So he comes back again off the layoff, just like he did the year before, and runs a career best number and wins at Belmont Park in just thrilling fashion. Manny Franco opened him up on the turn. He was winning by 7, and it was over. I mean, he was geared down, coming down the stretch. Now, here we are. We're moving up, and we got a race on the 27th, 23 days later. So not even 4 weeks. Not ideal with this particular horse. So you ask why. We know that he probably wants a little more time between his races, and he's run great fresh. Why do we run him back when we do? Well, the condition book is written as such where if you don't go in a specific race, like once he breaks through that non-winners of one other than on May 4th of 23, He's eligible for the 2 other than. They don't write that race as often as you might hope at varied distances. So if we skip the race on May 27th, we would have had to wait till July 1st for the other race. Now, knowing what we know, maybe we probably could have, but that's a long layoff for any horse. And the other part of it is you have a horse that, for the most part, has a hard time staying sound for long periods of time. So, Aaron, the question becomes, when you write and you're looking at the condition book and you win a race and you go on to the next condition, if it's 3 weeks to 4 weeks away and you skip it, you're looking at probably 8 to 9 weeks before that race comes back. And when you think about Saratoga this year, we're involved in things like weather. So
that's a lot of training. That's a lot of, pounding every day to have 8 weeks between races with a horse and the other thing is he looks so confident on May 4th. And there's the whole other aspect of this is you have to strike while the iron's hot. That's the balance, is like the horse is doing well. They're coming off a win. That also factors into it.
Well, yeah. And especially with him. Joe, go, please.
No, I was just going to say that Aaron makes a good point, is that, if you are waiting for another spot, it's not as if you could take that horse out of training, send him down to Florida, put him on a farm for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, then bring him back up again. He needs to be in training the whole way. So, Aaron, it's a tricky balance, because like you want to wait for the right spot, but like you also don't want to waste a horse's energy who you only think is going to come, race 4 or 5 times a year, training day after day after day after day without being able to run, right?
Yeah, and Dale Romans taught me that, especially with an older horse who they have the foundation and they know what it's like to go to the gate. They know the drill. He's like, unless you absolutely have to, you don't really want to take them out of full training, because you want to keep their blood going. You want to keep them, agile and their mind and on business. Unless they absolutely need to be turned out as older horses, they can kind of come back after a break and be like, I don't think I want to do this anymore. So you don't want to stop totally unless it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I think we spent a lot of time on the last podcast talking about Voodoo Zip, who had got really quirky as he got older. You look at, the horse that obviously, Aaron, we know best is Twilight Eclipse. Tom Albertrani never really totally took him out of training. All 8 years, 7 years he trained the horse. He basically would just keep the horse at the barn and just jog him, light training, turn him out in the afternoons. He never really just sent him to the farm in fear that, he might realize he likes the farm better than the racetrack. And with this
routine, your horse. Some horses, they absolutely thrive in their routine. And I think that's how Twilight was. It's like there was no reason to mess that up. He had his groom, he had Joe Green, he had Tom. I mean, he was in that system for so long. And trust me, I am all for horses going to the farm and being turned out and just being allowed to be horses, but it's got to be the right situation. And he's a great example. Like when he was at peak performance, it was best to just keep him in his game.
Right, exactly. So circling back to QF, in a perfect world, would we have loved to said, hey, you know what? Every 5 to 6 weeks, there's going to be a race for him and we'll come back. And the other part of this is, the other variable is distances. They don't necessarily write the next condition at the ideal distance you want. So you're like, well, geez, people always say, we run a horse, it wins. Okay, there's an A other than, Born Noble was a horse that is going to run this weekend. There happens to be an A other than going the distance that they want for him. I mean, I look at these condition books, and as the foal crops have diminished, the job of the racing secretary is to put out the best card for the betting public, to appease the horsemen, but also to put out a card that people want to bet on, that's what creates the handle, which creates the purses. So all of a sudden they run that race back on, on May 27th. And, it's the same distance that he just won at.
I think it was a short field, right?
I'm sorry?
It was a 6-horse field.
Yeah. And obviously we had Dripping Gold in there also. And, Portfolio Company is the greatest stakes horse. I mean, but these 2 other thens and 3 other thens in turf racing, we talked about it on the last podcast. There's not a huge difference between that and a listed stake or a grade 3. I mean, you see it at Gulfstream. They just ran the Pan American, and it was a 12-horse field, and half of those horses had run for a tag at one point in their career. So,
Yeah.
you know, so I guess the to put a bow on this is, you know, we're not oblivious to what we, you know, what we want to do in mapping out a horse's plan. Unfortunately, you are limited sometimes by the races that are available, the distances they're run at, and then in the case of 2023, weather conditions where, you know, we'd run him on the dirt one time, and you know there was some thought that maybe, even though he ran so hard, he might have did more damage than good running that hard a race on dirt, that he you know beat himself up a little bit. And when you have a horse that you know that, hey, I get 4 or 5 races before he probably needs a break, you try to be as judicious as possible, but it's not always that easy, right, Joe?
Yeah, that's the whole thing, is that like he's an interesting cross section of a lot of the challenges. Like he has his own needs in terms of needing spacing for his races. And he's also one of those horses that graduated from the one other than level, but then has a little bit of trouble competing at the 2 other than, and then even if he were to clear that, the 3 other than level. So he's kind of that tweener that we have in the barn right now. I wanted to shift gears a little bit to this.
Thing on
Yeah, go
QF,
ahead.
finish it up is, and the one thing to keep in mind, and you've essentially alluded to this, Tom, is every time you win a race, the next condition, there's a smaller horse population to make those races go. And I think if you look at his last 3 races, actually, Turfway, Laurel, Delaware. Okay. So once we saw that he was having a hard time with the 2 other than in New York, we were like, let's take him to a, you know, a little bit softer circuit. The purses are still good. He can be very competitive. But what you run up against there is his first, you know, his 2 wins were a mile and an eighth. He's a mile and an eighth horse through and through. It's very difficult to get those races written past a mile at those, I'm going to call them B level tracks. Because why? A lot of their card has, you know, lower level claiming races that they're running. So when these upper level allowance races are written, it's once every couple weeks, and it's an easier spot, but you're not going to be able to kind of pick your perfect distance, perfect timing. They're just not written enough. So there's a positive to go into an easier circuit, but then on the flip side, the negative, and we run into this with a couple horses at Turfway and even at Santa Anita, where the races are not written past a mile, and it's frustrating, but your hands are a little bit tied unless you want to start shipping all over the place.
Yep. We're going to get to the logistics and the challenges of shipping horses in a second. But I wanted to ask about this because this is something that I was curious about, and I'm learning more about since I've joined West Point, is the process of securing a jockey for your horse. Now, jockeys and jockeys agents necessarily have a very kind of topsy-turvy life. Like they're constantly adjusting and shifting and trying to get this horse and that horse every single day. It's a very hectic kind of lifestyle. But from our perspective, from an owner's perspective, Aaron, I'll start with you. Can you just take us through a little bit of the basics? Like when we have a spot, when we have a horse, we're pointing to a spot, we know where we want to run. What happens? How do we try to get the best jockey possible?
So by and large, those decisions are mostly left up to the trainers. The trainers know the horses, they know their nuances. You know, they sometimes will have jockeys come out and work the horses in the mornings. So sometimes you'll have a familiarity level. They're aware, you know, of the beat of the jocks agents, where the jocks are going to be during a month. You know, you'll see a lot of the jockeys, you know, this time of year, they may be riding at Gulfstream, but they'll head back to New York for a couple of days, or they'll go to Oaklawn for a big day. So that's something as owners, we don't have as good of a handle on kind of those inner workings and the relationships with trainers and jockey agents. You know, I think there's probably some trainers that are on the phone with a jockey agent every day. Just talking about different horses and different conditions, who's pointing where, stakes dominate. And we can go into this a little bit more about how, you know, trainers they get very frustrated with jockey agents, but then they can also use them as an asset. So there are times where our trainers will weigh in. You know, an example would be You know, we had to make the decision with Carson's run. Do we leave Dylan Davis on for the Breeders' Cup? He done a phenomenal job with the horse, but he had not ridden much, if at all, in California, and Joel Rosario was available. So those are the instances where an owner could get involved, and you kind of bounce around the pros and cons. But on a regular day, we're pretty much leaving those decisions up to the trainer and the jockey agent and whatever the trainer believes is the best fit for that particular race.
Yep. And it's
It
just
gets pretty complicated, as we'll get into.
well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I was going to lead into is like just when you think you have a jockey booked, it doesn't necessarily always work that way, that they end up being legged up on the horse. Tom, can you talk about a little bit sometimes of the complications that come when you think you have a jockey and you end up having to scramble for another one?
Yeah, and let me just take one step back. And Aaron brought up a great point. The jockey agent trainer relationship is love hate. Okay, they rely on the jockey's agent for information. Like if we're pointing to a spot, especially I'll use the Clement barn because I deal with them a lot, and they are on the phone. Miguel is on the phone with jockey agents morning, noon, and night. And it's about who's running where, who's going to Canada, who's going to be in town that week. Chad's going to run what horse that race. The jockey agents know what horses they've given calls to that are being pointed to those races, even more than the racing secretary will tell you. So if all of a sudden you call up, and let's say, for instance, Christoph's A guy is Rosario. He's using Dylan a lot. He always liked Manny Franco, and now Flavien Prat was in New York, the French connection. So all of a sudden he's using him. So let's just say, for argument, those are the four guys, maybe not in that order, that he's using. So he's got a horse that's going to run pointing towards this spot, and he reaches out to Ron Anderson, who's Joel Rosario and Johnny V's agent. And he says, are you open on this day at that time? And he'll be like, yes, I'm open. Okay, I'll pencil you in. Or I'm not sure I'm going to be in town. What's that? I'm riding for Chad that day.
I got one for Chad.
Well, and you'll also, not to totally make light of that, you might say, yep, you're all set. And then all of a sudden, 3 days later, hey, I'm not going to be able to ride you that day. I have a horse for Chad I have to ride. And
going to run originally, but then things change, and I've won 3 races on this horse for Chad. I can't not ride him.
So the question becomes, if you have a true give and take relationship in any business relationship, yes, you gave your word, you gave the call, but now this other so if Clement's gonna, if he's gonna hold his feet to the fire and say, no, you gave me the call, either you ride me or you ride no one, and that happens. And that's why you see sometimes top riders riding for top outfits, even though their horses are 10 or 15 to 1, as opposed to, picking up other mounts, just because you have those relationships. Right now is a very rare occurrence in horse racing. Irad Ortiz is riding first call for Todd Pletcher and for Chad Brown. I can't remember very many times in the history of horse racing where the top 2 trainers in the country are, with the exception of Bob Baffert on the West Coast, the top 2 trainers on the country are both using the same guy as much as they are. It's a real balancing act for his agent, Steve Rushing, who ironically also has his brother Jose's book. So it's a real balancing act with the family. Obviously, Jose picks up a lot of those mounts, as well as now Luis Saez. You're seeing Louis ride quite a bit more for Pletcher now, as well as Louis was out at Clement's barn working horses the other day, trying to get into that barn. But it's a commitment. It's a verbal commitment. Whether it's a contract or not, we'll leave that to court of law. But I can remember there's been times in a real dark spot on our history when we had a call on Twilight Eclipse in a grade 1 for Javier Castellano, and his agent spun us, and Tommy dug in and he said, no, you gave me the commitment. And they said, no, you didn't. And lo and behold, they went to the stewards and they basically told him he couldn't ride in the race if he didn't ride us. And, it turned ugly. And ironically, Rosario was going to ride us. He got injured. Javier ended up on it. But, later on in his career, I'm personally convinced he got back at us. You know, he rode a race that literally put us in a horrible spot, and there's not a doubt in my mind that, you know, he was like, okay, you know, you guys can try to mess with me, but, you know, the guys in the room, they band together. They might be your friend. They might shake your hand and give you a hug, but they're a band of brothers in that jockey room.
Enough. Javier and Twilight are right over your left shoulder.
Literally in Tommy's shadow.
grade one win right there. Ironically, the other horse, War Dancer, he's right down the street from my house.
Right.
I drive by that farm 5 times a day. I go, hey guys, we're still better. But you know, the elephant in the room is what happens when you make a decision with your trainer on jockey selections. Everybody knows this week we had a very difficult situation. We had Integration as one of the favorites in $1 million race at Gulfstream Park in the Pegasus. Little history. Integration makes his career debut at Colonial and is ridden by Tyler Gaffalione and wins first time out, breaks his maiden. Surprising to many of us, Shug wheeled the horse back in the Virginia Derby. Now, jockeys are booked weeks, multiple weeks, almost sometimes months in advance for big races. When the Virginia Derby, we spun back, Tyler had already committed to ride somewhere else, not at Colonial that day, if I'm not mistaken. And
probably Downs or Saratoga. He probably had, even though he loved our horse, he probably had 6 stakes to ride in somewhere else, all live horses.
And when he rode our horse initially to the win, I don't think any of us thought, oh, we're going to wheel back in 3 weeks in the Virginia Derby. I remember getting calls about it from partners, educated partners who said, what's this about? And I said, I mean, I don't know. It's not Shug-like.
Shug's on the record as the saying that's not my style.
Yeah. So here we are. Luckily for us, Kendrick Carmouche is down at riding at Colonial on the off days of Saratoga and picks up the mount and rides the horse flawlessly, and we win the Virginia Derby. Fast forward, we go to the Hill Prince at Aqueduct. So Kendrick keeps the mount, and the horse runs phenomenal, ties the track record, amazing. So now we're going to the $1 million Pegasus a few months later. Shug has to decide, does he want to stick with Kendrick, who's ridden the horse flawlessly 2 times in a row, but has virtually no experience at Gulfstream Park? Or does he go back to Tyler Gaffalione, who rode the horse originally, did nothing wrong to lose the mount, who is one of the top 5 jockeys at Gulfstream and rides there every day? I mean, it's not an easy decision. And I give him a lot of credit. He took a lot of heat about the decision because everybody loves Kendrick. Kendrick's one of the most popular, charismatic people on the racetrack. I don't think anybody will sit there and look at you and say that Tyler Gaffalione doesn't have a lot more experience at Gulfstream Park than Kendrick, and Tyler's riding in big races every day of the year. Now, the flip side of that is, how does a guy like Kendrick ever really break through to the big time if he doesn't get to keep a mount on a big horse and go forward? I get it. It was not an easy decision. It was not something that Shug really asked for a lot of input on. I mean, this was a decision that he made. He stood by it, and we all said, okay. I mean, it hurt. It hurt because we like Kendrick, and some of us have to see him on a regular basis. And you want a guy like that to do great because he's always so giving with his time to our partners and always so giving around the racetrack. But it was a decision that was made. Now, fast forward, things didn't go our way on Saturday. It was a brutal trip. It was, everything, you name it, it went wrong. And then, of course, the Monday morning quarterback came out and the second guessing came out. And how could you do that? It wouldn't have happened with Kendrick. Aaron brought up a great point. David and Gordon, Darren, why don't you say it? Because it was a perfect point about what David said regarding if it had been Kendrick.
Yeah, he said something that David and Gordon said something that resonated with me. In most cases, you can never go wrong getting the top guy available. And Kendrick has ridden a lot of great races for us, but the fact of the matter is Tyler Gaffalione is one of the hottest jockeys in the country right now and knows Gulfstream like the back of his hand. Now, agree, Saturday did not go according to plan. But on the flip side, if Kendrick would have had that trip, I think people would have been freaking out. Like, you had Tyler Gaffalione sitting in the jockey's room. How could you not have taken advantage of somebody with so much experience on that, which is a pretty unique turf course? You know, it's the turns are tight. It was very firm. I mean, we know that, Tommy. Look at the times the other day.
Right.
You know, and Kendrick just has such limited experience at Gulfstream that kind of hit me, is like, you know, there's definitely a little bit of a loyalty factor sometimes, but I think we would have been hard pressed before the race to know that we had somebody who knows that turf course so well sitting in the room.
Right. And you know, the one thing that I come back to, and when you make these decisions and trainers make these decisions, and you know, I always joke when they ask about how decisions are made, you know, trainers always say, I don't give the jockeys a lot of instructions because the good ones won't, the bad ones won't listen, and the good ones don't need you to tell them. Well, it's kind of like, you know, we pay our trainers. We have a Hall of Fame roster of trainers. Either all of our trainers are in the Hall of Fame or will be. And they're not going to listen to us most of the time anyway. You know, it's like, I always joke, have you asked them about what race, this race or that race? You know, you might mention something to them, or you might, hey, I don't know if you knew this horse's half brother won 4 races on synthetic. Just, I don't know if you knew that, you know, stuff like that. And they'll give you the side eye. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. And, but you know, in these type things, you know, I keep coming back to, just because it doesn't work out doesn't mean it wasn't the right decision. Right. You know,
and go ahead.
Yeah. I mentioned Irad Ortiz, and you know, obviously I followed his career very closely for the last 10 years, but he's riding at an insane level right now. Watching him on Saturday, even if he had a horse that the 13 post, I mean, he was just making every move right. He rode us on a favorite in the Breeders' Cup a few years ago. Wouldn't have traded places with anybody. And he had a bad trip. The horse didn't break well. He moved up. It was just a nightmare. And it happened. And that kind of was a nightmare what happened with integration. I don't know if he would have beaten that filly. I think we probably would have been at least second, but I don't really know in my heart we would have beaten that filly because she was forwardly placed and she moved early. You know, tactical speed in turf races at Gulfstream is essential. And we might have been a little too far back just in general, you know?
Yeah, I was thinking that. And, you know, I was annoyed after the race, you know, just naturally you're like, God.
Not you.
Yeah. But then I kind of thought about it. The turf course was so firm. Think of this scenario. You know, I think Tyler knew that they were going pretty fast up front. He didn't want to get stuck too far back. But so then you kind of get into like a half pregnant scenario where you're like, I don't want to get too far back, but I don't want to be too close. But imagine if he was like, you know what, I got to go. And, you know, he was chasing this fast pace, then everybody would have lost their mind. Right. You know, that was definitely like a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And that filly was just so good that she was able to be up there in that pace and finish. But, you know, we would have been going nuts imagine if both of them just went up there and went like a bat out of hell and they both backed up. I mean, it's just, it's so hard to predict.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, a couple of takeaways from that race for me is that first, Ryan Moore is awesome. He's a great ride. Can we get Ryan Moore on one of these horses at one point sometime? Because he really rode that race terrifically. And I think Tyler got a little bit unlucky, you know. And the other thing is, like you're saying, like it's easy to be an expert and a genius when you don't have to make any decisions about the horse. When you're just on Twitter or you're just Monday morning quarterbacking, it's very easy to say what you should have done and what you shouldn't have done. And like Aaron says, it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. So Kendrick's going to be fine. He's going to ride plenty of nice horses, plenty of nice horses for us, I'm sure. And I think Shug made the right decision in terms of process. You got to think of the process and not just the results. So that's my feeling on that.
Last thing is, and that David also taught me, just because it doesn't work out doesn't mean it was the wrong decision. And I think that was true for Saturday.
Yeah, 100%. And the horse is still super, super exciting. And Kendrick will probably get a chance to run it and ride him at some point. And, if not, he got a couple of really nice stakes wins out of it. One more topic we want to tackle before we wrap up for this episode is about shipping horses, because, it's in the vein of, you look at the local condition book, not a lot of suitable spots for your horse. You might have to think about shipping out of town, whether it's close by, you can van, or whether somewhere you might have to get on a plane. General question. I'll start with Aaron, and then Tommy, I got a couple of questions for you. What are the logistics of shipping a horse? Like, how easy or hard is it to book a van, to book a flight, the costs involved? Like, what kind of factors go into making that decision?
One of the good things about, especially a lot of our horses being in New York, and in the Mid-Atlantic, is there's a lot of vans that are shuttling kind of all over the place, and nothing is within a couple-hour drive. So you're in a very good spot to be able to pivot. Say you enter a race at Laurel and it doesn't go, you can very easily pivot and put your horse on a van to Delaware, to Belmont, to Colonial. In California, you're really not shipping much at all. You're running, Santa Anita, Del Mar, and there's a system. A lot of guys will stable at Santa Anita, but during the Del Mar meets, if they don't bring their horses down there to stable, there's a shipping program. Where it gets a little interesting, and even in South Florida, there's a network of van companies and private haulers who will go from Tampa to Gulfstream and back. The training centers, a lot of our horses are stabled off-site of Gulfstream, but they will go to Gulfstream to run. Where it gets interesting is if you are somewhere and you're getting into the 10, 12, 24-hour van ride, and that is not ideal, especially if you're coming in on a big race, that you put your horse on a van for that long. Think about how you feel after a long plane ride. I mean, it takes you a couple days to be hydrated again. Your muscles are sore, your joints are stiff. So once you kind of get into that half-day ship, and a lot of horses do ship very well, they're in box stalls, they're bedded down, they have attendants, but you do get in a zone where it is easier to fly. But there are challenges that come with flying. It's not like you can just go online to southwest.com and say, I have one horse on February 16th. I want them to return on the 19th, and you put in your credit card and you're done. The flights are very few and far between. And Tommy can talk about a recent instance where that really kind of bit us a little bit. But there are not a lot of horse flights. And there may be, and I'll turn it over to Tom, it's a perfect segue. There may be a flight to California for a race, but it's 3 weeks before you ideally want to go. And you've got 70 other horses at home. What do? Do you go with your horse who's preparing for a grade one, or do you stay home with your other horses? So Tom, why don't you talk about the story of Ava and how that transpired?
Yeah. The Breeders' Cup was at Santa Anita this year. So, we shipped all the horses out that needed to ship, that went out. Carson and obviously Slider was already there. And that, as Aaron said, it's when there was a company called Tex Sutton was basically the horse shipping. Well, Tex Sutton's out of business right now, and your only option really is FedEx. And FedEx, they had planes shipping from the East Coast and the Mid-Atlantic and Kentucky to Santa Anita for the Breeders' Cup. Well, Santa Anita's opening day is the day after Christmas. It's a famous race day, as many of you know, the Malibu, the La Brea, big time races, the last grade ones for straight 3-year-olds, one for colts, one for fillies. Bob is being pointed there basically since the late summer. Like, that's the race that we have a circle around. Well, lo and behold, we get ready to ship out on a plane that we have a date, and they cancel the flight. And one of the reasons is it's Christmas time, and all of your packages that you're ordering online pay better to fill a plane with all those boxes and packages, and they basically they just cancel it and don't ship horses. So this has happened. Now we're in a horrible spot. Do you ship a horse by a van that might take 2+ to 3 days to van across the country? Some horses need to be medicated when they go on a van at that hour. Obviously, with medication limitations, you don't want to ship your horse out there and have something that could still be in their system and then get a positive. And then the flip side is, what do you do about staffing? You know, okay, I'm going to go out there. I have to go out 2 months in advance, a month and a half in advance. Well, that's fine if you have a string out there, or you have an assistant out there that is, been with you, like Todd Pletcher. Mike McCarthy was his assistant for a long time. I'm sure that if we gotten the filly out there a while ago, John Sadler's barn would have looked after. But when you have a filly running in a grade 1, and that's your pride and joy, you have to send an assistant, you have to send a groom, and you're going to send them out there for 2 or 3 months to prepare for a race. And then you're flying back and forth twice a week, or, a couple times a week, just to keep an eye. It's a massive undertaking.
And a lot of times you want to ship and run. You don't want to train over a whole new surface for 2 weeks, 4 weeks. And then it messes up your breeze schedule. And that's what Cherie was up against. Like, she missed a work at the fairgrounds already due to the weather. So then it was like, okay, if I send this filly out to Santa Anita, we might miss another work because she's got to acclimate and settle in after a long trip. And then before you know, your whole training schedule ahead of a marquee race is out of whack. And you can't win grade 1s being out of whack. We know that.
Yep. What I'm gathering from these podcasts is it's like Murphy's Law. Whatever could go wrong will go wrong at some point in horse racing. That's why you need expert people to manage the horses. And West Point has a great team of people, of trainers, and obviously the team we got here, including Aaron Birkenhauer and Tom Bellhouse. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us. Once more, next time we're going to talk about how to look at the condition book online and overnights and the difference between those two. So keep tuning in. Write in the comments if you have any horses you want us to talk about specifically. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Tom. See you guys.